Tinakoto. Welcome to the Asia Pacific Climate Week and to our side event on Foreseeable Future, Seamless Integration of Data to Enhance Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction. Climate change and disaster risk poses a serious threat to our physical, social, economic, and environmental condition of our communities. The potential increase in the occurrence and intensity of extreme weather event as a result of climate change, coupled with increased population in the vulnerable areas, reinforce the need for improved prediction and forecasting for a foreseeable future. The climate change and DRR need to have a seamless, systematic approach to integrate it together to better and sustain our development goals. Dear participants, thank you so much for joining us today from various parts of the world. Please feel free to say hi or providing any comments and questions in the chat box for the time being. We'll have a proper question and answer session after the presentation where you'll be able to share your comments or question based on the presentation. On behalf of Core Data Task Group on Disaster Risk Reduction, as well as IRDR of International Science Council and Tonkin and Taylor, together with UNFCCC, we welcome you all again to the side event. We have various speakers today joining with us from different parts of the world. We have expert from Asian Development Bank. We have an expert from Green Climate Fund, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, GIZ, and Tonkin and Taylor. Together, we'll be sharing with the role of Green Climate Fund and in accelerating climate change. We'll be sharing the climate risk country profile and risk assessment in investment. We'll be listening from them on the coherence on disaster risk reduction and climate change. And as well as finally, we'll be also hearing about the National Climate Change Risk Assessment from New Zealand. With these things, I just like to invite all our speakers to joining with us today. And we can start the presentation with myself. My name is Bapan Fakhruddin. I'm the co-chair for Core Data Task Group for Disaster Risk Reduction and also work in Tonkin and Taylor based in New Zealand. I'll be talking about the foreseeable future, the need for seamless integration of weather plus climate information for disaster risk reduction. As you can see, the effect of climate change and extreme weather become more apparent, and the integration and integrated approach for climate and DRR are the success to build any resilience, and which is also a priority for our COP26. There is an enhanced need for different timescale future climate information that would enable us to better decision making, as well as allowing us to the opportunity to appropriate prevention. And in that sense, obviously, as a user, you're always asking for a long-range weather forecasting or medium-range weather forecasting or quite extra long-range forecasting information to better prepare our decision-making process. If you look at the slide here on the left, when you talk about the integration between the DRR and climate change, it is happening, but it is also quite complex to making sure a seamless integration. We try to look at all the frameworks that has been applied in different communities by various entities and how they are actually overlap with the climate change and disaster related activities, and together how they can actually better enhance, better improve the overall coherence, overall the integration, and reduce the duplication effort. And this is just a snapshot. You can see that recently there are a couple of frameworks which talks about more 80 to 100% overlap between each other. There are 60 to 80% overlap between the frameworks, and then there are 40 as well as 0 to 40%. But on the other side, on the right side, you can see the way we try to use the vehicles or the engine or the process to overall the risk assessment or integration, the climate change and disaster risk reduction into different domain. When we look at the social, built environment, cultural, economic, natural environment, there is also a process engaged to look at more actually how your overall governance systems works to making sure that they are quite interlinked, and how you set up a more sort of preventive environment where you're able to support the impact or understand the impact of hazard. And then you try to look at the anticipative, which is more on the understanding the future foreseeability or forecasting and predictability. And then it comes to the observative, which is more you look at the robustness, readiness, resourcefulness, as well as rapidity of the information. And then it more about the adaptive process, that how we make sure that our behavior actually try to adapt such kind of information systems. And then finally, a transformative environment where we need to be more transdisciplinary to work, come together, come forward and try to work on an emerging research area, because when this disaster and climate need to be working hand in hand, there are a lot of emerging research, emerging experiment, emerging systems need to be evolved, and how those system could be evolved that need to be looked at more coherently. But on the other side, if you look at our user versus user's expectation versus our forecast skills, as a user, we always have a high expectation, but as a science, we actually have some limitation on providing some information into more accurate or more reliable way. But if you look at the differential hazard in terms of, and different hazard has a different lead time for forecasting, and if as a user, if we understand those limitations, it's quite easy to understand the uncertainty, the limitation, and how we can actually work together to make sure that the information that the provider is generating, those are useful, used, and usable. In that sense, we try to come up with this kind of conceptual framework where climate science and risk evolution for a foreseeable future could link together based on the data that actually continuously generating by various organizations, various sources. There are IPCC, there are climate science, they are providing emission scenario climate science, and then there are actually climate change projection, there are annual and decadal climate forecasting or prediction information, there are long range forecasting, there are extended range forecasting, medium and short range forecasting, and these are actually generating by different entity, different groups, different provider, and these are all actually in a different separate computing systems. So you as a user, we as a user, we are not able to look this fundamental information into one single platform. What is fundamental for us? We are looking as a user different time scale information, but on the other side, we are looking at the magnitude of our hazard, whether that create any impact to us. So at the end of the day, we are actually looking at only this two-dimensional X and Y information. And if we could get those all information into one single platform with more integrated and seamlessly, it could enable us to better understand the tendency, what is happening next hour, what is happening next day, what is happening next week, and what is happening the week after, or decades, or in centuries. With that perspective, so you can see that how this kind of information could lead to our physical risk assessment. At the same time, it could lead us to our transitional risk assessment. And using this both physical and transitional, how that could be enable us to understanding the impact. In between, there are also a lot of modeling done through similar data set to understand the loss modeling aspect, which is mostly used by insurance company or the treasury on the point of financial risk assessment. But at the end of the day, we try to understand what is the impact, what is the supply chain distribution, what are the physical damage to asset, what are the changing in resources or pricing, or what is actually our supply and demand. And based on that, we can develop our climate mitigation and adaptation measures. And this is just an example. You can see that how a more robust and more data set could able to integrate together to better understand a response or consequences for any kind of particular hazard event. So when you look at the climate change scenario that able to provide you some seasonal outcomes, and then how you could try to put it into a risk framework to better understand your exposure and vulnerability, and linking that could generate some impact-based scenario for your decision-making process. But at the same time, we often neglect or try to underutilize all sorts of database that we have, or we could utilize to generating our model, generating our impact results. Here is an example. A drought could be a good example in this sense to generating a drought early warning. You may look at only one parameter, maybe El Nino, or maybe looking at the sea surface temperature to generating your drought. But there are many other factors often actually disturb the whole systems, and that could create a drought which may be neglected in your overall modeling aspect. So in that sense, it's quite important to looking at all sort of data that you can to produce your modeling aspect. But at the same time, the data that the model generate in an ensemble form, it has a potential use in a different forms. So a 1 to 15 days data could be utilized for application purpose. A 20 to 30 days could be applied for tactical decision, and a 3 to 6 months could be used for strategic decision or planning process. And that could enable us to better understand how the future would look like. With these things, I'd like to thank you everyone for listening to my presentation, and I'd like to invite Kevin Horsberg from Green Climate Fund to talk about how the Green Climate Fund, the role of Green Climate Fund in accelerating climate action.
Thank you very much, Bapon. I've just requested the screen and I seem to have control. Okay. Not entirely sure how I control it. Let's try down arrow. So apparently I have control. So in answer to Charles's earlier question, it's not clear what the control is. The arrows are not advancing it.
If you just click, that will be working, I think.
Ah, perhaps. There we are. Did I do that? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Kevin Horsberg with the Green Climate Fund. So Annyeong Haseo from South Korea. I'm going to be taking a rather different direction to begin with. So I'm going to start off by talking about money, but hopefully the role and the relevance of climate data will become clear as the talk goes on. And I hope it's obvious that good climate data is just as relevant for developing a proposal for climate finance as it is for creating a multi-hazard warning system or seasonal prediction. So that's the sort of connection into the theme of today's talk. I'm going to talk about the role of the Green Climate Fund in accelerating climate action. And so a quick history of the GCF. It was established at COP16, so the GCF is 11 years old. We have been approving projects for climate adaptation and mitigation since 2015, and the mission of the Green Climate Fund is to create a paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways in developing countries, and we are a financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. So this timeline here shows the operations of the Green Climate Fund, and that final sort of panel there needs to be updated slightly, because last week we had our 3 times yearly board meeting. If I can just advance the slide. Now, there seems to be a bit of a delay on the remote control if one is in a different continent, so we might have to abandon that. All right, there it's coming, it's coming. So last week, just to bring everyone completely up to speed with the operations of the GCF, we approved 4 further projects to a grand total of $501 million US, and those projects were across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The total portfolio for the Green Climate Fund now at the bottom there, the final bullet point is 8.85 billion of Green Climate Fund support, which actually leverages a huge amount of other finance from other multilateral funders, international development banks, and other organisations, as well as the governments themselves in countries. So one of the sort of aspects of GCF funding is that it can mobilise and encourage significant additional funding. The way that Green Climate Fund works is very much country-driven. Proposals coming to GCF are developed in consultation with individual countries as part of their national adaptation plan to create a pipeline of proposals through the greenhouse gas mitigation for adaptation and resilience planning. We work with over 200 accredited entities and delivery partners in total. So we're able to mobilize different skill sets, bring those together in ways that are unique to particular project requirements. That same agility applies to the financing instruments that the GCF can deploy, from sort of simple grant finance right through to blended finance, bringing in significant additional finance from the private sector, which is a key ambition of the COP. We aim for a balanced allocation between mitigation actions and adaptation actions. The target is for a 50-50 balance in the longer term. And within the allocation, the adaptation side of our portfolio, we aim for a floor of 50% of that to go to least developed countries, small island developing states, and African states. So we're specifically mobilizing adaptation funding for the world's most vulnerable. And many of the projects are sort of investing what's called patient capital, so investing in a fund that then sort of mobilizes future funds in order to create long-term stability, sustainability of projects. So here's an example. There's one particular project. It's called the Global Subnational Climate Fund. And you can just see from the numbers there, if you just sort of compare the GCF finance to the other project investments, which are from in-country investments and other funds. So the GCF funding sort of unlocks and it sort of magnifies the total amount of funding available for a project, which of course, you know, makes the projects far more ambitious in scale. And so when we say paradigm shift, what we're looking for there is a sort of transformative way of changing how projects are implemented, making sure that they're scalable up to other countries or across regions, for instance, and then making sure that beyond the duration of the project window itself, that they are sustainable and that other funding will pick up the investments, will pick up the innovations. One of the projects that was approved at last week's board meeting was a project regarding adaptation in the Indian Ocean. It's called Building Climate Resilient Safer Islands in the Maldives. So this is a $25 million project looking at enhanced coastal management for the Maldives. And it just sort of exemplifies our support of the small island developing states. And you can see from the figure at the bottom that we're now investing over $600 million in support of SIDS. Another small island, and one that's particularly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise, Tuvalu, whose average elevation I think is something like 1.8 meters above sea level, is especially vulnerable to sea level rise in the longer term. Tropical cyclones in the shorter term, and of course the sea level rise merely exacerbates the tropical cyclones. And in 2015, I think most of us would remember that something like 45% of the population of Tuvalu was displaced by Cyclone Pam. So this is another adaptation project, building coastal resilience in 3 of the 9 inhabited islands through a really sort of far-reaching adaptation strategy that includes beach nourishment, includes hard defence measures, but is also taking an ecosystems-based approach, as well as a sort of as a kind of organisational approach to make sure that there's sustained investment and sustained interest in the project through creating sort of youth stewardships as well. And in order to have a successful project with GCF, of course, there are steps that need to be gone through. So one of the very enjoyable roles that I have is to help proposal developers create the necessary evidence and scientific basis that the proposed project, that the proposed interventions are as a response to a climate threat, because that is the essential requirement to qualify for GCF funding. So adaptation proposals need to make that unequivocal connection to a climate threat. mitigation proposals have to align with the country's national determined contributions for emissions and show that the emissions reduction would not have happened without the funding, that it wouldn't have happened anyway. So these fairly straightforward conditions require evidence. That's what we refer to as the climate rationale. So one of my roles is to help all of our proposal developers create that climate rationale with a range of tools and a range of data. And you can see now that this talk is converging on the need for climate data as much as an early warning system requires it. And so we provide sort of guidance, we provide technical assistance, support, and over the next year I'll be working with the World Meteorological Organization as well to develop a broader set of tools to do precisely that. So there is already a climate information portal which we're continuing to work on, and we hope to provide some sort of high-level user guides to help anyone who wishes to develop a proposal use this and other climate information platforms in order to build a credible proposal. Now, for some reason, this isn't working, and it's not. Here we go. So this is called the Climate Information Portal. It's something that GCF has developed with the World Meteorological Organization. It has the full ensemble of CMIP6 models, which can then be interrogated in terms of quantities and variables, which then feed through into the calculation of the more complicated indices, such as BAPON gave a great example for drought just now. So providing that support is central to helping the development of a strong pipeline of proposals. So just to conclude, I think everyone accepts that there's a very small opportunity, very narrow window to act if we're to meet the 2 degrees of the Paris Agreement. But it's possible, and we have seen over the recent months some very ambitious country commitments, not least from China and from the USA, to accelerate their carbon neutrality. But of course, translating those commitments into action requires climate investment, and climate investment is also required for adaptation, because even if we are able to stabilize our CO2 emissions such that we meet the Paris Agreement goals, then there's still a commitment to sea level rise for many hundreds of years. Adaptation is no less important than it is now. We at the GCF work very closely with our country partners and our accredited entities to provide all of the necessary assistance and support to create projects that address both mitigation and adaptation. And my final point, which is the value of information, data and tools, is that good climate data is truly multi-purpose. You need it for a multi-hazard warning system. You need it for climate information services, such as seasonal agricultural services. You also need it to effectively validate climate models, which we all use. And then finally, that data has a vital role in creating the successful proposals for climate finance. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think you raise a quite critical point on this, especially on the small island level, and data availability for climate change scenario or ensemble scenario, and how critical it is to better understand actually the national scale or the asset scale climate risk assessment. And I think on that point of view, Charles would be having a quite good talk about how it is quite essential for a development partner to investing any sort of activities, the climate risk assessment, and how the climate risk assessment profile could be developed. Over to you, Charles.
Great, thank you very much, and welcome to everyone who's joining us here over, I think, many time zones. Let's see if I can advance this. What is the key that does it? Enter, we'll try.
I used the down arrow, but there was a bit of a delay.
You muted.
Okay.
I can run for you, Charles, if that's
okay. If you could advance, please. Can we see the talk here? Yeah. So anyway, what I'm going to talk about is one specific aspect of ADB's climate risk management program. And it's a recent thing, and it's just now coming online. And these are country risk profiles. And the broader context, of course, is to improve the quality of investment decision-making under climate and climate change, and then related natural hazards, if we can sort of go on from here. First, just a very brief word about ADB for those who don't know. We're a regional development bank located here in Manila with offices in something like 40 countries throughout Asia and the Pacific. We've been around a little longer than 50 years. And currently our lending stands at around 20 billion a year. And starting a couple of years ago, we put in place our new long-range strategy called Strategy 2030. And among the top operational priorities are tackling climate change, building climate and disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability. So, I mean, we've been working in this space maybe for 12 to 15 years, but it keeps rising in importance, emerging as importance as we get a better sense of just what the risks are and how they affect our developing member of countries. And so we see we have a couple fairly ambitious targets. Well, our general approach now is something we might call climate risk informed decision making, which is basically taking account of climate and natural hazard information at a range of scales to help us not only select the projects that we finance, but to design them and implement them in ways that minimize the adverse effects. And you can see that there are quite a number of potential impacts, and impacts in longevity, impacts in performance, costs of maintenance and upgrade, and just overall reduction in the economic performance of a project. And this is extremely important because, unlike, I think, perhaps a lot of the operations of Green Climate Fund, our primary modality is loan at concessionary rates. We do provide some grant finance. So if we're loaning large amounts of money to sovereign borrowers, both we and they want to have some confidence that we are not facing essentially unexposed risks. So that's at the heart of what we're trying to do here. Okay, so up until now, really since its foundation, ADB has had very much a project-centric kind of an orientation. We do large public infrastructure in a number of sectors. There would be transport, there would be energy, there would be urban development, there would be agriculture and natural resources, and a few others like health and education. And our approach to managing climate risks is to focus on the project. But we have come to understand that we need to take a broader view of that. We can't just simply draw the boundary around the project itself, you know, the bricks and the mortar and the components. And we have to look at the setting. We have to look at the environmental setting, the social setting, the institutional setting, and so forth and so on. And when we do essentially a climate risk assessment, all of those things have to enter in. And one of the recommendations coming out of our recent review is that we need to do something more to move our climate risk management framework upstream. Projects at ADB start through a process called a country partnership strategy, where we and the borrowing country essentially agree as to what the development priorities are that ADB will support. This leads to a kind of an indicative pipeline, which in any given year is manifest as a certain number of projects that go through a concept stage, a project preparatory phase, an implementation phase, and then long-term monitoring and evaluation. And we haven't really paid enough attention to the upstream part of that. So that's one of the things that we're focused on here that provides a background for these products I'm going to describe. And another thing which is coming up, it's very much an active area of work between ADB and the other multilateral banks and financing institutions, is something called Paris alignment. And that is a commitment on our parts to make sure that the largest number of projects that we finance are consistent with the commitments and the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, both on the mitigation side and the adaptation side. So, for example, they are aligned with national mitigation and adaptation objectives and commitments. And there are a couple elements of this that I think are going to become extremely important. And one of them is a sense in which we need not only to attempt to perform adaptation, but also to avoid maladaptation, which can take many forms, and also to do no significant harm with respect to the Paris Agreement and its objectives. So this will become an increasingly important consideration going forward. Okay, if we can move on from here. I don't know how well you can see this, but what I've done here is I've essentially mapped indicative project lifetimes onto the sort of the broad ensemble of projections from, and this is CMIT-5 right here. And as you can see, there are projects that we finance that might run anywhere between essentially cropping type projects that have a focus essentially on annual climate or seasonal climate, up to maybe planning studies that go out a decade. And then we get into things like road maintenance, irrigation rehab that take us out several decades, and so forth and so on. A lot of our urban projects are around 50-year service lifetimes. A large dam might have a 70 to 80-year service lifetime, and a major bridge might be closer to 90 or 100 years. And the issues that raises are that much of this still very much requires an understanding of contemporary climate. We can't design, say, a 20-year road maintenance and upgrade project by looking at the end of the 21st century. We have to consider recent history and what might go on. And of course, is very well known, historical data is relatively low uncertainty, but it becomes of increasingly uncertain relevance as we go forward. But if we switch over to the climate projections, they of course present us with high levels of uncertainty, especially for very long-lived projects. And even a project that we design, say, for a 50-year service lifetime, still has to perform properly under the present. So this is one set of challenges. If we can go on to the next one here. Another one concerns the kind of climate data that we need to be interested in. Now, I don't know how easy it is for you to see these, but for example, each project has a characteristic set of requirements, a set of priority variables and resolutions, both in space and time, annual, seasonal, short-term event, and so forth. And you can see here that some classes of projects, agriculture and irrigation, are very demanding with respect to the climate data. Others, like energy and road transport, much less so. For roads, for example, our primary concerns are just materials performance, pavements and expansion joints under elevated temperatures, and the design of drainage to avoid flooding. So each project has a different set of requirements. Another consideration that we've spent a lot of time working with, and we've heard a lot about thus far, is uncertainty, especially as we go forward. That it's essential that the project team and the borrower as well understand just what kind of confidence we can have in our projections going forward. And this tool that I'm showing here, this bivariate scatter between changes in temperature on the vertical axis in degrees centigrade and the percentage changes in rainfall on the horizontal axis, vary extraordinarily widely between individual GCMs. We're looking here at two representative concentration pathways, and we have to decide how to make use of that data going forward. So now I'll go quickly here to the product I want to describe, which is the country risk assessment. And first, let me know, these are being co-developed with the World Bank Group, and they build on data that's been put together for the Climate Change Knowledge Portal, the CCKP, that many of you are familiar with and many of you, I think, have used. Currently, it's populated primarily by CMIT-5 data, although that will undergo change fairly shortly. And the historical data is largely, but not exclusively, from the Climatic Research Unit, the CRU data sets. And we're looking here at essentially the table of contents. So we provide some background on each country. We're looking at Indonesia, by the way, here just to illustrate. We have both baseline climate, which is to say historical climate, climate futures, climate-related natural hazards, and I've listed a number there. The impacts, the projected impacts of climate change on several important sectors, and then on the policies and programs that are in place. And the point of this particular document and the data that would support it that you could find if you needed more detail out on the World Bank site is essentially to guide the thinking both at the country partnership stage, the pipeline development stage, and the concept stage, so that all the parties involved, they're coming in with a reasonably sort of a common understanding of what the issues are that we're going to have to design around. And we're just flip through quickly a number of the areas here. If we go one forward here, this is we like to provide a certain amount of country level data, and there's a lot more that I'm showing you. I'm just showing you some of the relevant tables and such. That basically we want to understand where the country lies with respect to development status, with respect to poverty, with respect to a number of other indices related to health and so forth, just so we know how our, what segments of the population we want our projects to target and so forth. And if we go forward, then of course there's the baseline climatology. And what we're seeing here is a snapshot for the country. But in fact, you can zoom down, I think, to essentially 50-kilometer resolution detail on the climate change knowledge platform site itself. And again, many of you will have used that, but here we try and provide both maps, tabular data, and graphs to present a kind of a picture of both present climate and future, which we'll see. And again, it's historical data is not irrelevant, even though we're facing climate change. Many of our projects will see much of their service lifetimes essentially in contemporary climate. So we can't leave that behind. Okay, next. Here is just a little information that we present on natural hazards. This is summarizing output from international databases, just so we see what some of the important natural hazards are. And then I've included also some of the sea level rise data. And all of this is being updated. Here's some of the projections data that looks at, I can't even see the, I guess we have precip and temperature data here primarily, and you'll see there's a fair amount of variation. And we look primarily at two time slices. We look at the sort of mid-century, 2040 through 2059, and then a 10-year or 11-year time slice toward the end of the century, which will be applicable to a few projects and to long-range planning. And the baseline for all of this is, I think, 1986 to 2005. And then here's a sort of a snapshot of the kind of data we include, and there are links to all of these documents so that we can see at any one time just what types of key documents the country has submitted, the date that it was submitted, maybe work underway currently, and these things are updated on a timely basis. So that's just a very quick walk through. The documents are about 30 to 40 pages long. And so to sort of recap here, ADB has for the last 10 or 15 years taken a very project-centric approach. We basically take projects that are predicated on development outcomes, and we evaluate them for climate and natural hazard risk, and we make adjustments that we feel best address those risks. It's basically an approach many people call climate proofing. Increasingly, we are trying to actually increase the number of adaptation and resilience projects in the pipeline, which again requires that we go upstream to the country partnership strategy, which is an ongoing process of negotiation with our developing member countries that leads to an updated partnership strategy usually on about a 3-year basis. And we're looking, in terms of designing a climate risk approach, we're increasingly focused on what we're calling the 3 Ls. First, of course, is service lifetime, which tells us how concerned we have to be about climate projections far into the future. The degree of lock-in, meaning how easy is it to change either the design configuration or the scale of a project in the future when more information and better information becomes available to us. Some projects are very rigid. In particular, location is often very difficult to change, but there are often other things that you can build in a certain degree of flexibility around. And the third is what we call the level of concern. And this is extremely important. And this is essentially the consequences of being wrong about our assumptions. And if we can imagine, say, a hydropower facility that, there's a risk of overtopping if we seriously underestimate the design flood, among other things. Other things are less of a concern. If we overdesign the drainage on a road project, basically all it does is cost us a bit more money. So this is a concern. And again, to recap, we need to expand the boundaries, and we need to prepare ourselves as best we can for the project of Paris alignment, which every single project that we do starting in about 2 years' time will be subject to. And so the risk profiles are a key element, not the only thing we're going to be needing, but one of the key elements in supporting that process. And I'll leave it right there. And I will, how do I surrender control?
Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you.
For providing a quite a brief information that how we need to ensure our investment as a risk informed and how this climate change profile could help country by country. Just for your information, there are, I think, more than 15 or 16 actually profile is already in the knowledge platform. So anyone who is interested in different Pacific Island, Southeast Asia, those are available to people to look at. While we have listened quite briefly the aspiration of our foreseeable future, and then from there on, we see the generous funding from GCF to helping the climate change adaptation and mitigation, as well as we saw from the Asian Development Bank, how the risk profile and then the investment need to be risk informed. And now we need to go back to our colleague UNDRR, Genti, to talk more about, as we know, what about the disaster risk as well as integration of climate change adaptation. And she'd like to welcome to the risk as we know it or we know it. Over to you, Genti.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here today. Let me just check if I am now in control. Vapon, I've asked to...
Approved.
Ah, perfect, great. So let me see. There we go. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just honing in on a couple of points I think that my colleagues from the GCF and ADB have raised, which is essentially around this issue of how good is the climate data? Where are we data rich? Where are we data poor? And how much are we ever going to be able to continue sustainable development in this current context? And essentially, the points I'm going to raise today, I hope hit on a couple of points, which are, we do actually know a lot. We don't expect to be able to predict GDP in 2100. And yet there's an assumption that we should be able to predict the climate with the same level of accuracy. And I think what we're recognizing now as a climate community is that we need to get more comfortable with parameters of uncertainty, but we also need to get better at valuing the knowledge that we do have, and also making sure that we use it to make decisions that enable us to operate in what will be a more unpredictable and volatile future, but where we also have at our disposal scientific research methods, climate models, but also a wealth of other data that can really help us make better decisions. So this idea that we need to hold off and be cautious and wait for better data, I don't believe is really correct. I think that we have more than enough data to make good decisions now. In terms of my presentation, which I'm still having trouble changing slides on, is there it's just going slowly, okay. I think that for most of you, if you signed up for this workshop, you probably have a sense that there is already a relationship between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And you've probably seen a chart a bit like this one, which shows that, yes, there's a lot that we can learn from how we traditionally manage disaster risk in how we look at climate adaptation, but there are also a lot of things that don't overlap. And while that's still correct, I think that understanding of where risk isn't really enough to help us maintain the sustainable development that we all want in the modern world. And instead, I'd like to have a model that looks a little bit more like this. Next slide. Is that you, Bopan, or is that me? I think it may be you. And the point here is that essentially we're in a world of growing risk in a shrinking world. We have forces like climate impacts, which are causing obviously direct impacts in terms of losses after a particular cyclone, but they're also causing knock-on effects, cascading impacts, and that also for all of us who lived through COVID in the last year, it's very clear that those impacts can really work across whole systems, so that a health disaster can actually have impacts on economies, on investment, on women's empowerment. So risk is systemic, interconnected, and cascading. Next slide. What that can mean is that on the one hand, it can feel a little overwhelming. Oh gosh, there's too much data, it's too confusing. How do we as a small country begin to manage these interrelationships? But on the other hand, it's also quite empowering, because I think what's increasingly becoming clear is that there is already data out there, and there's a lot that we can take from the whole development community that can actually help us to accelerate adaptation action. From the disaster risk reduction community that I've developed my career in, we see that there's an awful lot of data that we've been collecting for years around things like economic losses attributed to disasters, number of deaths, economic loss in relation to GDP, but also in terms of coping capacities, country capacity, that has grown out of the disaster risk reduction community, but it definitely can help accelerate Paris, and it can also help accelerate sustainable development. And one of the reasons why this is important is that adaptation needs to stop being thought of as a particular sector that the Environment Ministry thinks about, and starts to need to be understood as a verb to adapt that all parts of government need to be thinking about. And of course, if you speak in the language of their own metrics, of the Sustainable Development Goal targets they set themselves, it's much more compelling than coming and saying, because you need to meet this environmental or climate change agreement, you need to act. If you put it in terms of, you won't meet your own health target, you won't meet your own education target, you won't meet your own infrastructure target unless you can align with us, it's a much more compelling argument. Next slide. And of course, this was very well understood actually at the writing of the Paris Agreement, but we sometimes forget it, because in Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, it actually outlines quite clearly, we hereby establish the global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability, and contributing to sustainable development. So it's pretty clear in there, and yet somehow over the last 5 years or so, we haven't necessarily looked into that with the degree of scrutiny that perhaps it deserves. Next slide. So just to sum up on some of the key messages in this presentation right now, I just wanted to highlight risk is systemic, it's interconnected and cascading. Understanding risk is more than just understanding hazards. Climate impacts require urgent, transformative, adaptive action. We simply cannot contain or maintain sustainable development unless we speed up transformative adaptation action. And the days of this one hazard, one impact, single probabilistic risk model are over. It's important that we start to understand how disasters interact, how multiple disasters interact, and to be more agile and responsive to changing situations. It's important to link our understanding to multiple hazards and to make sure that exposure and vulnerability are not ignored, that you don't just focus too much on the climate driver, but you really focus on what is that going to do to your sustainable development trajectory. And that if we interconnect our knowledge on this, it is complex, but it's also clear that the better we link our data, the better our analysis can be, and the better we can begin to have the tools for discussing and making the choices that we need to explain how climate change may affect our future. But in this last slide, I also want to stress, there's not a single risk model or a single risk assessment that's going to answer all your questions for you. But it is important that you begin to have the tools to look at the various options and to look at how different scenarios may play out in your context, and then that you're able to bring different voices into a discussion to make your future projections. Next slide. So in terms of some of UNDRR's work around this, we essentially focus on 3 different things. The first is around strengthening risk information and evidence. That's through some of our work on things like disaster and damage loss databases, risk assessment, but also in terms of monitoring disaster risk reduction. We also focus on promoting comprehensive disaster and climate risk management. This is essentially getting beyond that first slide that I showed you today and saying, look, let's try to look more holistically about how we can accelerate achievement of both the Sendai framework and Paris and the SDGs simultaneously. And then the third is really focusing on how we can get that into local level action through things like the Making Cities Resilience campaigns, but also some of the other work I'll describe today. Next slide. So one particular initiative I just want to spend a couple of minutes on is called the Global Risk Assessment Framework. And this is essentially targeted towards countries who traditionally might be considered as data poor. Because one of the great paradoxes of our development community right now is that at global level, we say, oh, we have this amazing data and look at these maps and it's, you know, we have global data sets for this, that, and the other. And yet in most of the countries that I speak to, they say, we don't have that kind of data. We're data poor. We need more research. We need more analysis. We don't have these statistics. And so it's important. So the graph has basically been designed around 4 pillars. The first one is trying to help countries better access and use the risk information they have. Part of that is helping them access some of those global data sets that in some contexts they may not be even aware of are useful, or they're not sure how to use them, but also helping them access other forms of data they have in country, like SDG tracking data on vulnerability around gender, demographics, migration, economic development, and apply that to a climate context. But it's also about helping make sure that there's more standardization and interoperability of that data. And then the second pillar of the graph really focuses on helping them understand that in the context of systemic change. So it allows them to pick a particular systemic risk question that they're worried about, something that they see, they think that there may be issues of, for example, migration fueling increased vulnerability as a result of flooding. And it lets them hone in and apply some of that data to look at a particular systemic or cascading risk question. And that's then, of course, backed up with some capacity building and some advocacy and partnership work to make sure that the results of that assessment and of that data aggregation don't just end up sitting on a shelf or on one particular professor's laptop. Next slide. So essentially what we're doing in the 15 countries that are currently working with GRAPH, and we hope to scale that up to 100 countries within the next 5 years, is under that pillar 1, we're really trying to look at that data standardization and interoperability. And we're really working with a lot of different initiatives. We're working with WMO, with GFDRR, with DESA, with a number of different, with the UN offices looking at statistics, but also with the national disaster departments in many, many countries, looking at what is the existing hazard and exposure data, what is the vulnerability data, what is the climate change data, and what is the disaster profile, both in terms of the past disasters and the annual losses, but also in terms of the disaster trends that are emerging and being driven by factors such as demographics, migration, or displacement. And essentially what we're trying to do is help countries to aggregate that data in one place so that when there are collaborations to look at, for example, different types of risk assessments, or when there are research projects trying to look into the feasibility of a particular project, that the database from which they can pull, and this is all essentially available but scattered data, that the quality of that is higher, and that the accessibility of that is higher, and that the understanding within that government about what that data can and cannot be used for is higher. Next slide. And then on top of that, we then try to look at this issue about how do you begin to think about not only that multi-hazard risk assessment that might help your adaptation planning, but actually try to think about it in terms of what systems might be affected. And we're doing that really based on country developed requirements. So for example, in Bangladesh, they've said to us, look, we really want to focus on trying to understand regional variation. And so we're helping them downscale a number of indices that are looking at vulnerability and exposure. This is developed through an indices of aggregate indicators called the Inform Index. And we're working with them on that, trying to take that down to subnational level so that the quality and granularity of their regional data is much better within the country, so that they're better able to understand how climate change impacts and adaptation might be affecting their communities differently depending on location and different social demographics. But the systemic question that Costa Rica's asked us is very different. That's more about understanding what their future climate costs might be and what their financing requirements are. And while in contexts like Sudan and Somalia, we're just beginning the conversations there, but they seem to be more interested around questions on migration and about how humanitarian need is being impacted by some of the more extreme events, and particularly the heat-related events that are affecting their economies and their populations. In Fiji, again, a different type of systemic risk question. They're asking how they can adjust their financing systems to better and build in anticipatory financing systems, not only to the humanitarian side of their debate, but also into how they might look at financing for example, future cyclones or larger events that they can also look at building into their budgets and even their social protection systems. And some, it's a little bit more in just the straight national planning exercises. But the point here is that it's important to have your data ecosystem. It's important to be able to use the data you have effectively to make climate decisions, but it's also important to define what some of your key systemic questions might be and to dig into that a little bit more. Next slide. So in terms of where I think really we need to focus in terms of accelerating adaptation, it's really around looking particularly at adaptation metrics, beginning to look at the questions of loss and damage, the point where adaptation isn't possible anymore and where you need to make different types of choices about either transferring risk or bearing risk in different ways. And there needs to be a sea change in how we think about financing. And I think colleagues from the GCF highlighted this very beautifully earlier on. It's really about thinking about this as the driver of sustainable development for the future and a shared responsibility. It's not about donor finance anymore. It's about thinking about how does the private sector make sure their investments are resilient, and how does the public sector make sure that they accelerate action that is risk informed. Next slide. So in terms of some of the areas that I'd like to highlight in terms of success in future adaptation, it's really about scaling up work to support climate change adaptation, including in developing the national adaptation plans. And as you can imagine, some of the work that I've already outlined in terms of improving the data availability across not only the climate side, but also the social and the exposure side, the vulnerability and the exposure side of that adaptation planning is really essential to making sure that it's about that we begin to better understand how climate adaptation can really affect overall sustainable development. In doing that, there's a lot of work in terms of how we measure what is effective adaptation that really needs to be honed in on. And that's another piece of work that I think is going to be a real focus area for many of us moving forward. If we don't look at how we measure success more effectively in adapting, it's very hard to say whether or not these investments are really doing what they should be. Next slide. But it's also important that we scale up action to look at what happens when adaptation in the traditional sense is no longer feasible. We look at things like the impacts of sea level rise and coastal saltwater intrusion, and we begin to more actively think about the kinds of choices that need to be made to make sure that sustainable development can continue in that context. And again, here is where it's really important to begin looking at a different type of metrics that looks at cost benefit in a more integrated way, that doesn't ignore the fact that at a certain point, the most effective action may be adjusting your coastal planning parameters, Right now, this is a very unexplored and very haphazard aspect of how we're looking at the adaptation and loss and damage part of the equation. And it's really important that UNFCCC mechanisms like the Santiago network, which were set up to try to improve that, are strengthened, but also that there's more learning across countries, both from the South and from the North. Everyone is struggling with these same issues, that element around metrics and measurement of adaptation and of loss and damage are really a focus as we move forward, because otherwise, as others have said, there's a huge risk of maladaptation, but there's also a huge effectiveness gap that we may face. Next slide. But of course, this does need improved investment. And this is not only ODA grant finance. This is really about thinking how governments invest for particular timescales and for their own resilient future through their budgeting. It's not only about looking at how do you build that particular coastal project, but it's about changing your whole financing structure to make sure that your pension fund is actually well prepared and well positioned for 2100 when it will be paying out for some of its younger members. It's about making sure that your bank approvals for building take into account climate change models. It's about recognizing that where tools like insurance can and can't be useful. And it's about changing the concept of what risk-informed investment means and putting that at the center of decision-making. And in doing that, it's also about getting better at anticipatory action, particularly getting ahead of the curve, not only in the sense of humanitarian relief, but also in terms of thinking through the types of structures and mechanisms that will be needed in 2050, 2075, and 2100. Next slide. And so just to sum up, I'd like to end with a quote from the Secretary General, because I think it sort of sums up quite a bit the reason for this session and why we're all here today. If I had to select one sentence to describe the state of the world, I would say that we are in a world in which global challenges are more and more integrated, and the responses are more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it's a recipe for disaster. So I hope that from today's presentations, you'll get some inspiration about how to reverse that sentence. And I look forward to working with you all on being part of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenty, for really providing us so much on the emerging research that UNDRR is actually leading, and how some of those transdisciplinary activities are actually assisting to integrating the disaster and climate-related adaptation activities. With these things, we now like to move forward with Dr. Sandra Schuster from the GIZ to talking about more on the GIZ work on climate change adaptation and risk assessment in the Asia and the Pacific. Sandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bapon. And if you can forward my slides, I'd appreciate it. I think that works easiest. Thank you so much. So thank you again for the invitation. And I'm trying to give a brief insight into GIZ's work on climate change adaptation and risk assessment. So a brief overview on the content I'll be covering. So it's a few facts on GIZ as a background for those of you who may not know GIZ. Then I'll talk a bit more about climate risk insurance, which Gentle just mentioned as well, as part of climate risk management, but also for infrastructure. And it's also popped up by Charles. Within this, I will also mention the green recovery activities and adaptive social protection as a new framework, as well as a framework that we are using. And interweaved in this, there will be country examples to make this a little bit more, I guess, real, perhaps. At the end, I just briefly want to mention our community of practice on climate risk that some of you might be interested in. Next slide, please. So GIZ is a German federal enterprise working in the field of international cooperation for sustainable development. And I'd just like to highlight a few numbers here. So we're currently working on 1,600 projects in 120 countries. Almost 70% of our employees are national staff, and our workforce actually is almost 60% of our workforce is female. Next slide, please. As you can see here, we have experience and skills in a wide variety of areas. So the infographic that is just showing here shows our impact of the climate change portfolio. And sustainability is the principle that guides our actions. So we believe only by combining social responsibility, ecological balance, and economic capabilities that current and future generations will be able to lead secure and dignified lives. Next slide, please. So this just briefly highlights, again, our diverse network and broad portfolio and our established collaboration our partner countries can benefit from. So our work promotes social change processes, as I've mentioned. So we support our clients and commissioning parties throughout, from providing initial advisory service to actually implementation of projects. And in staying with the theme of advisory service and implementing projects, I will now briefly talk about our work on climate risk insurance and project examples on climate change adaptation and risk assessments. In the interest of time, I will only be able to briefly touch on some of those aspects, but I've provided the links in the sources. You will find them in the presentation, so you can read up further on them if you're interested. Next slide, please. So GIZ has developed 3 advisory services on climate risk insurance. So one as part of climate risk management, one for infrastructure, and one in the agricultural sector. And the download links are provided here. So as we all know, climate change is exacerbating the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. This is causing damage to infrastructure, disrupting economic activities, and putting higher risks on people, their livelihoods, and assets. Public and private sectors have limited financial and also human resources, not only to cope, but also invest in resilience. We have found that they often act more short-term. Often they act on more short-term priorities, and they lack awareness sometimes of the direct and indirect impacts of climate change. The point therefore must be made that investing in resilient, climate-proof infrastructure and other public assets is a worthwhile and cost-effective way. In particular, considering the long lifespan of infrastructure that also Charles pointed out in a very nice slide. And it's also the key role in ensuring the resilience of our communities. So in doing so, insurance payouts, they can improve the post-disaster response and recovery activities by providing timely financial resource to public entities or direct target groups. However, it also needs to be mentioned that insurance in generally does not reduce the risk, but it transfers the risk. So for many risks, other coping strategies are much more cost-effective. For example, drought-resilient seeds, or perhaps even relocation programs. Insurance may not be suitable in all contexts. For example, sea level rise, as far as I know, is still excluded. And it's not a standalone remedy to manage the climate risk. So it's one instrument within an integrated climate risk approach. And I will briefly describe this a little bit with more examples in the next slide. So here you see our approach of an integrated climate risk management framework. And this consists of 5 phases that some of those phases you will be quite familiar with. Prevention, addressing residual risk, preparedness, response, and recovery. So in the prevention phase, you look at hazard exposure vulnerability analysis, which are conducted. And then they're supported by decision tools, such as cost-benefit analysis. So a disaster risk framework, management framework that's aligned and actually implemented. So insurance, as well as broader social protection systems, risk financing instruments, and risk retention can address the residual risk. I still would like to highlight here that insurance can or could or perhaps even should incentivize increased effort in risk reductions. Next slide, please. So applying this approach across different sectors. I've collated a few examples here for you, and you can see here the links if you have further interest in their details. So I'd just like to highlight here the retention and transfer segment on the top right corner. So here the project on developing climate and disaster risk management approaches in Ghana aimed at the preparation for implementing risk transfer schemes with an integrated flood risk management approach for municipalities. So in this project, amongst other things, historical loss data and assets were evaluated, technical capacities of data providers were enhanced, and risks were analyzed. Overall, this led to better understanding and quantification of flood risk, improved the risk management and reduction, as well as transfer of the residual risk. If we look at the prevention segment on the left side here, I've highlighted examples from India, namely the MGNREGA B, which stands for Environmental Benefits of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Act, and WASCA, the Water Security and Climate Adaptation in Rural India. So I will elaborate on those in the next slide on these projects, while also covering aspects of adaptive social protection, which you see here specifically under response highlighted. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, as well as other shocks, have yet highlighted again that poor population groups are especially vulnerable because they have little to no savings, few or no alternative livelihoods, and this all results in low resilience. So where does adaptive social protection come from? In essence, it's social protection that is crisis-proof and supporting adaptation to climate change. A shock-responsive social protection can result in the stabilization of livelihoods for the poor, for example, through cash transfer and cash for work programs. And social protection programs are also instrumental for climate change. And I will elaborate with this on the example of India. So adaptive social protection is therefore a broad long-term adaptation of livelihoods, ecosystems, and infrastructure. So in our methodological approach, we consider 3 points. It's firstly the strengthening coordination of actors in social policy, rural development, environment, and climate change, and disaster prevention. So quite practically, this could be technical advice on improving the quality of local measures for adaptation to climate change. So the management of water catchment areas, the cleaning of canals, rehabilitation of irrigation system and critical infrastructure, and also agroforestry. The second point in this approach would also be the orientation of public employment programs towards promoting adaptation to climate change and food security. A good example here is not from the Asia-Pacific region, but the afforestation, the Saharan Green Wall project, mangrove protection, watershed management and again also cleaning of canals. And then the third approach in this is also looking at the strengthening of governmental institutions for better local implementation of these measures on a broad scale. So that example from India that I want to mention is basically based on 2 programs. One's the MGNREGA program and the WASCA program. So MGNREGA is basically a Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and it entitles every rural household in India with an employment guarantee of 100 days per year. It's the largest public works program in the world. It covers almost 130 million families, so around 20% of India's population. Also, I want to highlight here that about 53% of the workforce there are women, and it has a strong focus on building drought-resilient and flood-proofing works, so adaptation co-benefits. But the real interesting point is that it was not designed to be a climate response. Hence, GIZ developed WASCA, water security and climate adaptation in rural India. So here we built upon this MGNREGA project and with a climate resilient integrated water resource management approach. So we essentially look at demand and supply within a watershed. And on top of that, we also developed a planning framework. We call it composite water resource management planning framework. And that covers 4 dimensions, namely water, climate, social protection, and livelihoods. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I will just briefly highlight this as you can then perhaps later also look into these examples if you're interested in. So in Ghana, GIZ and Allianz worked on products. These are specifically now for infrastructure related. And that I also want to highlight in this slide. We also worked on flood risk and transfer schemes in Morocco. And globally, we've also worked with the Global Initiative on Disaster Risk Management, supporting the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. But I don't want to overstate my time. So next slide, please. And this is yet another example from the region more in the South Pacific. So this is a global program on human mobility in the context of climate change. And I just want to highlight here that our adaptation efforts in this regard, where villages have been resettled, is really looking at, we supported Fiji with its planned relocation and displacement guidelines. That is the point I wanted to make in this slide. And then briefly, the next slide, please. I just want to very briefly highlight a community of practice on climate risk that GIZ has been founded in 2018, where we really want to have a regular exchange among experts. I welcome any of you if you're interested to join. We have currently 2 active work streams. So one is on comparison method of climate risk assessments. The other one is on climate risk communications. We used to have annual meetings, as you can see here, but in COVID, we had a few in consultation calls. And yes, let's see how this continues. So with that, next slide is just to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for sharing a couple of quite good examples from various parts of the world, and thanks for joining with us. Now, last but not the least, I'd like to welcome Mania Soni and Richard Ryan Hamill from Tonkin and Taylor to talk about the National Climate Change Risk Assessment from New Zealand. Over to you, Mania and Richard.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. So Mania and I are going to do a little bit of a tag team, and we'll try and keep to time and probably keep it quite high level. So we were involved as part of a bigger team to undertake the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. I was the project director for this, and Mania was involved in Te Ao Māori perspectives in the stakeholder engagement. If I could have the next slide, please, Babel. Next one. So with all national climate change risk assessments, this was providing an overview of how New Zealand is affected by climate change, and it's looking at risks and opportunities. As this was the first one, it was also, I guess, a little bit of a trial to identify any gaps for future further consideration, and how this information is going to be used and updated to track our response in terms of adaptation, but also the changing climate that we have. A key objective of this was to inform the development of the National Adaptation Plan. That was something that's going to drive government policy, give clear direction to communities and stakeholders on the priorities that government was set, and also identify, I guess, areas where they're not going to be putting investment and other measures needing to be taken in place. So a large part of this was supporting stakeholders, and Mania, if you just want to take us through that.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So a key part of the national process was, I guess, twofold in their elicitation of information to help understand climate risk, and climate data was part of it, concurrent with the education component. So really raising the national profile of climate change risks, so that you could get a wider and broader buy-in for adaptation and mitigation is the next step.
And I think with the New Zealand context, the co-governance with mana whenua or the Indigenous populations are another important step. And I guess the National Climate Change Risk Assessment was, I guess, one of the first national assessments where this co-governance with mana whenua or the Indigenous population was tried and applied. So when we looked, we were part of a broad consortium. The government had another team of experts and specialists developing a framework, and our job was to implement the framework and test it live and in real time. And it was framed around the 5 domains. So as part of the living standard framework in New Zealand, we look at the built, the natural, human, the economic, and the governance domains as all part of a risk assessment process. So this creates some complexity when we're looking at things that aren't necessarily done consistently. All of the previous talkers, I mean, the economic and the social and the infrastructure are commonly done. How we look at the governance and some of the natural environments from Te Ao Māori perspective were some interesting challenges. Our approach was with a fairly conventional risk screening process. So we ended up a long series of risks through the elicitation process. We identified with all of these climate hazards, what were the priority areas, and looking at the impacts across on a national perspective. If we go to the next slide. So our scenarios was the 8.5, and that was used initially for this high-level risk screening to make sure we were looking at capturing the range of hazards and impacts. And then when we were doing the risk assessment process, we were looking at the 8.5 and 4.5 as our key indicators. And through this process, the long list of risk screening, through an elicitation process that Mani is going to be talking about a little bit later in the engagement part, we developed a shortlist where we could do a detailed risk assessment, where we used a combination of both numerical risk assessment tools, but still strongly engagement and elicitation focused on some of the other risk factors to end up with a prioritization list. And the prioritization list also provided risks per domain. So we had identified 10 risks per domain as a summary, so to make sure that we were providing coverage across all the domains rather than focusing on one specific domain, even though there may be some bigger impacts in those domains. And that led to the adaptation plan. Next slide, please, Babylon. So when we were prioritizing risks, they were all the extreme risks that were identified through that process across the 5 domains, and also all major and moderate risks that occurred in more than one region. And for this climate change risk assessment, we divided the New Zealand landmass into 5 areas, and we also looked at the coastal marine area, or the seas around the New Zealand and offshore islands. Next slide. Whoop. Okay, so when we ended up for the detailed risk assessment, it's looking at the exposure, vulnerability, and consequence, so fairly traditional methods in understanding that relationship for the risk. It provided insights on that spatial impact at a national level. It also identified gaps in information in some of our areas where, even within the New Zealand context, our data was variable, some of our baseline information, and across those 5 domains, there was a variety of data richness, I guess, and leading into the uncertainties and judgments that need to be made to provide that overall impact assessment. Now, we had some real challenges in that cascading risk and the consideration of interdependencies. And Mani is going to be touching on some of those in the next few slides on the engagement. From our first risk assessment, we identified and considered those at a very high level, but that is going to be and is now programmed in as a feature of work over the next 6 years leading up to our next climate change risk assessment. So now we're going to talk about, I guess, some of the more challenging parts of the elicitation process and engagement. Anya.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if we think about engagement twofold in terms of elicitation and the education component, at the national level, I guess we had a real challenge in engaging at that macro level with communities and stakeholders, particularly with presenting national climate data without being able to connect that for stakeholders and communities to what they were experiencing day to day. And that was particularly true for New Zealand's Indigenous population, iwi, who are geographically based as tribes and who have unique stories and connections to place that help us to understand climate change. So the time period at which they look back over the past, and also the timescale to which they look forward, and they're talking hundreds of years. So it was about how we gather that and actually feed it into the national climate change process. Next slide. And one of the things that we learned from that is actually how we communicate climate information more broadly is really important for us to think about, and the benefits that it can provide in terms of communicating climate information. So this is just a simple example of an output that we used in terms of working with communities, and that we're communicating in their language. So Māori is the predominant language that's shown here on this picture. And the graphic evolved in 3 it had three components to it. So first, the development of it was a conversation with communities and stakeholders around what they need to see to work with their communities to uplift climate conversations. And the second was the discussion that it generated around understanding hazards and data that would help them to do that. And then lastly, it was around the distribution, so how that could be distributed more widely and engage across the spectrum of their community, from young to old, from rural to urban, and so on and so forth. Next slide, thanks, Bepon. And learning from that national level around how to communicate and also how to consider risk in a way that's meaningful for stakeholders and communities. We worked with our Indigenous populations to focus climate risks on what's important and be able to have a conversation around them. So what you can see here is, I guess, an evolution of the donor economic model for those of you that are familiar with that, but applied in a climate context, and that the green circle is the things that are important to the communities that we were working with that might be at risk to climate variables. And those are the things that, for want of a better word, we want to protect and understand so that we can provide mitigation and adaptation to those, but also values that we can have a conversation around climate risk. And we've heard earlier around cascading risks and intersecting risks. Having a value-based conversation, for example, around water more broadly and all the risks that exist within that, was a really great way for this particular project to delve into the detail of what that meant in a more holistic sense. And that really was the value of incorporating and working with our Indigenous populations and bringing that Indigenous perspective alongside Western science and Western climate data. Next slide, thanks, Bepon. Yeah, so I guess just in a wrap up on that, what the National Climate Change really showed us was the risk assessment was that it provided government with a really good list of priorities to inform the adaptation planning that's underway now, and that these types of national studies ultimately assist globally in providing information of nations and their position and how they're planning. But this component of integrating Indigenous insights and valuing the information and the climate data that it brought, how we elicit that, and how it benefits a wider community conversation in that context was really valuable. Richard, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, and it was raised in some of the previous presentations that historic information and data is really useful. From the mana whenua perspective, they've got 800 years of insights and history. Oh, sorry, Manu, someone's just come to the door, if you could.
Sure. And I guess what Richard was touching on is that presents for those insights and opportunities and the deeper engagement and using knowledge alongside our more conventional Western approaches ultimately helped us to understand our priorities better, which is going to lead, I think, to more robust adaptation planning and a better buy-in at a local level to enable funding, investment and community participation in that process.
I'm sorry, I have to go and answer the door, but the matter of oral traditions and history and recollections to help build that historic data set was something that Mari really brought to our study, and having data sets of 20, 30, 40, 50 years was certainly augmented by some of those oral history recollections of their sense of place and the impacts that had happened. And I guess we saw that the Western worldview and the very detailed and segmented approach of conventional risk or hazard and risk assessments fitted better with the wider perspective first, from a more holistic view of the natural environment, community and economy, with the technical and the detailed data assessments providing colour and insights to that broader palette. What didn't work very well is when we tried to force or fit those Indigenous perspectives into that Western worldview model. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mania and Richard, for really to provide some insight at how a integration or blended approach by indigenous plus Western world or science information could be applied for overall national risk assessment. We'd like to go to now for the question and answer session. And participant, if you have any question, you can actually raise your hand in your screen. We can give you a floor to speak, or you can also provide your question in the chat box and we can actually able to answer from there on. Either way, you can actually just provide. I can see there is a, and also I like to acknowledge here some of the key message that I think provided by various speakers. Well, I can, before I comments, I can give a floor to some of the audience first. Amrit Sharma, I can see your hand, so I'm just providing, you can speak now.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I'm really thankful to listen to Jenti Chris as well, because she is well known about the Nepal. And my queries is also to her. So, and actually we, young researcher, we have been involving for risk assessment. And in developing countries like Nepal, I'm from Nepal, and we are facing a lot of challenge of data. And why there is investment on data generation is very poor, because we are only talking to achieve how to achieve the sustainable goals and Sendai framework or Paris Agreement. So in that part, how as we researcher can engage for data generation and how we can improve our knowledge and enhance our knowledge for better risk-informed society to develop. And particularly, I'm involving in the water resource, that means water-induced disaster, and trying to develop a kind of resilience measurement and risk mapping. So my challenge is that I'm in the phase of my PhD. So this is my concern. Thank you for this platform. Yeah.
Thanks, Amrit. Over to you, Jenti.
Thank you very much, and always a pleasure to see colleagues from Nepal. I spent several years there, and thank you so much for the question. Amit, I think you asked a beautiful question, and it's one I think that very much inspired a bit my presentation, in the sense that what I would encourage you to do is look at what is already there. And I know that that's not always the answer you want to hear, but actually there is quite a lot of data if you look at how it can be combined creatively. I would encourage you to reach out to your ADB office. Yeah, Nepal has a number of good climate projects. My sense is that in the documents that were developed for their GCF or ADB projects, there's probably some quite good climate analysis in there. It might be a bit tricky to access it. So you might need to email the office and say, please, I'm a researcher, can I access it? But what I would also look at is try to look at, it may not be exactly the perfect indicator, but look at what is coming out from the National Statistics Department. This is what we're trying to do with this graph process. Because often National Statistics Departments, they have data on land use, they have data on particular vulnerability around age, demographic, gender, these things. That data may be somewhere, but it may be in a particular avenue of a particular ministry. And see if you can combine those things. But the other thing to look at is some of the global data sets that might be emerging, because there are things like the global earthquake model that actually is doing some quite interesting global analytics, or the global risk assessment, GRI. There's a number of different resources. So there's quite a lot if you combine it. And then the other thing to really encourage is that when projects are being approved in your country, push for them to be open access in the data they generate, interoperable, and open source in terms of use. And I hope at some point maybe we'll have a graph project, and then I could say, oh, go to my graph country aggregation site. But I think it's really moving in the right direction. And if needed, reach out, send me an email, and I can try to see if I can connect you to something specifically for your topic. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenti. I saw also your hand raised. Do you want to ask any question, Jenti, to other speakers?
I had a question actually to the previous presenters on the New Zealand adaptation plan, because I think it's really fantastic what you're doing in terms of, you said it much better than I would have liked, than I did, about this need to recognize that you really should invest in the scientific side of improving the data availability and accessibility, and the investments you make in modeling are really worth it. But they're tools, and they're tools that need to be applied within communities about the choices that they need to make in adaptation. And I think that I'm really quite intrigued about what was the mechanism that you used to bring those community voices, because I know we talk about it in the context of Indigenous knowledge, but I think we're all parts of communities affected by adaptation, and we're all Indigenous communities in some ways to where we live or where we've moved to. How was that discussion done in getting those discussions into the National Adaptation Plan? I'd love to know more about that, and congratulations. I think that's a really interesting approach and one that we can definitely learn from. Thank you.
Amanda, do you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Jenti. It's a really great question, and it's been a real learning process, I think, too, that we've evolved from the national level into regional climate change risk assessments, which are currently underway. One of the key ways we did it was we orientated workshops for the domains that Richard mentioned. Across the natural environment, the built environment, and the human domain, and so on and so forth. And we had a very broad spectrum of subject matter experts that we brought to the table there to facilitate national workshops. And that was quite useful because we had many different subject matter experts come to the table who were not only able to share their input and their data, but also listen to the various input that each other brought to the table. And that was the same for our Māori populations, in that we also hosted a national hui, and that covered all of the domains, again, with the need to take a holistic approach to the conversation so that we could, at a high level, explore intersecting risks and the flow-on risks that came from those high-level priorities. Richard, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, because I think by engaging and listening to the Indigenous population and the local community's response and stories about what they've experienced, and with our analysis, be able to put that into context to they don't know what a 1 in 100-year flood is. They can say, well, remember the storm in 2017 and where the water came to. You have it. They go, oh, okay, that's what it looks like. It's communicating the hazard impact to something that they can get their feel, and then you can start talking about, well, in the future, if we have more rain, that could mean that happens more often. So you storify it, if you will, but give it some foundation that they can have a shared view on, and then you can start having a shared response for an adaptation.
It provided great validation for the robust literature review and other work that was gathered, which I think was really key, and then captured in that narrative form, as Richard said, which helped to tell the story across the country. Thanks,
Mania.
Thanks for the question.
We have one question from Farooq. Talks about the data silos, as well as, as the data is actually sitting with the various entity for a coherence site. I think one of the work that the core data task group as well as a UNDRR through graph, as well as the IRDR data working group, trying to promote to the countries that how we can actually make a centralized database so that it enables to everyone to look at your data for exposure assessment, vulnerability assessment, as well as risk assessment, but also understanding what is actually data talks about and what is your historical trend and how you can go look forward to the future. And that's quite happening in many countries. There are actually already examples that they're trying to, their statistical department is actually taking quite a lead role to engaging the disaster risk related data, climate change data, as well as sustainable development goal data into one single platform so that everyone can able to access and enable and one single metadata standardization is in place. So I think that's are happening, but we are getting there. Anyone like to add any comments on that? Kevin, your hand is raised, please.
Thanks, Bapon. Yeah, so it's a wonderful question, and I think it's one that everyone probably has asked at some point as they try and create that key report or proposal. And I think we've already seen some good examples in the talks that were given. Some of the country profiles that the ADB are preparing are, are quite excellent, and there are other things like that, and there is stuff on the World Bank currently. And the work that I'm doing as well is to try and provide links to those materials and more. And it strikes me so after the event, I was going to reach out to Charles and say, we really should share our information. We'd like to share our sort of portals and our interpretations of the data that comes from them. We'd like to link to yours because we think they're equally good. And it strikes me that there's an opportunity here for a kind of internet of knowledge, which is the internet, of course, isn't it? So rather than constantly seek a centralization, which is an easy way of articulating it, the solution is probably more one of interlinkages. And I think if we all have the same aspiration to make data available at the level and at the complexity and or simplicity that is required for various purposes, and we work together to do that and to share, then I think that's almost organic, that almost builds itself. So that to me looks like the solution. It's undoubtedly we need that resource, but I think a centralized resource, as always, runs the risk of never happening or happening for a short while. Whereas I think the distributed resource has a really good chance of success.
Thanks, Kevin. Anyone like to add any more question? We can take one more question, and then we can, I think, wrap up the session.
Actually, thanks very much. This is Farooq. Yeah, there's actually some good insights about the data availability and other, but actually as an early career researcher, actually what I'm facing the most, actually the data scarcity and data management and data availability. Yes, we are actually using the data from the global and regional models. They're sophisticated and unique models, but if we think about the areas specific data within a country or within a region, that I think we actually need more cooperation and actually more initiatives for all the organizations across the world. So yeah, thanks for this wonderful session. I look forward to knowing more from you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Farooq. If there's no more question, I think we can wrap up the session. One of the things I would also again like to emphasize, maybe for all of our speakers, I mean, we talked quite strongly today about data availability, data integration, how we can actually work in a transformative as well as on the emerging risk area. And also there are a lot of resources, guidelines, and practices actually. An example, good practices, lessons learned actually done on the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction. But we also need at the same time, looking at the COVID-19 experiences, we need to also emphasize that how our ICT network could be more strengthened, especially on the developing world, because without the ICT network, there will be a lack of accessibility of some of the global and regional database that currently many of those organizations have, and also within the country to accessing and communicating. I think that's one of the good lessons I think we provided, that how the ICT is quite important to ensuring a capacity building activities and ensuring the accessibility of the data and resources. With these things, I again like to thank every speakers for your time to joining with us, as well as all the participants to listening to this session. All the presentation as well as the recorded session will be available to the UNFCCC Asia Pacific Climate Week platform. So please feel free to access it if you want to miss any kind of portion, or if you like to utilize some of those, slide for re-go through those kind of information materials. With these things, if any of the speaker like to say anything, otherwise I like to close the session for everyone.